Hey everybody, it's Bob Crossan, Senior Managing Editor for Water and Waste Digest, and today I have with me Gary Wong. He is the Principal of Global Water Industry for OSI Soft. But before we got into our discussion today, I wanted to mention as well that Gary will be making an appearance in a webinar series about digital resilience hosted in partnership between Water and Waste Digest and Global Waterworks. The webinar is titled Approaches to Help Utilities Accelerate Resilience, and will discuss topics from navigating aging infrastructure and water scarcity to weather volatility. The webinar is March 30th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and we'll have a registration link in the description below so that you can register today or tomorrow or as soon as this video ends. But today, we wanted to talk about cybersecurity in the wake of the news about the Oldsmar, Florida water treatment plant, which was subject to a computer hack recently. So we will discuss that now. Gary, thanks so much for being on the call. We appreciate you taking the time.
Great. Thanks for having me here, Bob.
So yeah, I guess probably should start just broadly about this whole situation. Obviously, water systems need to have a lot of security, but when utilities are considering and determining security measures for their systems, what should they be looking for? And also thinking about that through the lens of like smart water having accelerated last year, what should those systems have in place to make sure that they are also safe?
Right. It's of course a very broad topic, and what we saw in Oldsmar is very concerning. And cyber attacks come in many different forms, right? We saw something recently with, say, solar winds last year to ransomware, which we see more. But with Oldsmar, it was definitely the actual system was being controlled by a bad actor. And so when we take a look at it, I think one of the first things that utilities really need to consider is access to the system. I think sometimes this gets overlooked where maybe too many people have access, and we see this quite often. And I think the question really comes down to who needs access to these controls and automation systems, for example, and can we restrict that to only the people, for example, the operators or people in operations that need access to the system? Because if you're able to limit the access, you limit the number of points of entry into the system.
Mhm. Yeah, and I've heard too from several OEMs who have SCADA software and that kind of a thing of having different login levels of credentials as well. So maybe you can log into the system, but only for viewing, and maybe you can log into the system, but you can only change this or that, and you don't have full control. And I've heard of that kind of a thing as well. Is that something that people should be considering depending on the size of their system, or is that should just be a blanket? Everyone should consider that.
Yeah, that should be really standard in terms of looking at that and having different access levels. But more importantly, I think there's many situations where, for example, managers have access to the system. And in this case, we're talking about a controls and automation system like SCADA, right? So
Hmm.
supervisory control and data acquisition. If you take a look at that name, so SCADA is a subset of these automation systems, you need to really kind of make a differentiation between the controls aspect and the data acquisition. So of course, a manager would want to see what's happening in their operations and their process, right? But it doesn't mean that they should have access to the actual control system. I think there's many ways, and we can talk more about that. But it's really separating the visualization and the analysis of the data that's being collected versus the actual controls aspect and the automation side of things.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
with I think with Oldsmar, um, the report mentioned, the operator saw some movement, mouse movements and stuff like that on the screen, but didn't think too much of it the first time around because he knew that, management had access to the system. But I think if people start with something very simple of, restricting access, and of course, architecting the system so it doesn't have internet access, for example, so it doesn't go out to the outside world, whereas
Mhm.
the control system, the network, is separate from the IT side of things, for example, or the business side. And it is, separated by firewalls and so forth is really important.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I wanted to mention as well is that from news reports that I saw, especially Reuters, I think broke that TeamViewer was used in this instance. So it didn't sound like it was necessarily a problem with the SCADA platform itself, so much as using TeamViewer to access the computer on site that so that you could adjust things. So it was an issue with that. It sounded like rather than a SCADA platform or something like that. But I wanted to talk also about the protocols and how to establish those. What should an organization consider? How do you train people to look for suspicious activity, and what protocol should be in place when they recognize something that could be suspicious?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, education is really important to, to all people that are working in the utility in the organization. And often we see people maybe writing passwords and sticking them onto their monitor, things like that. Even down to having protocols to say you can't use USB keys.
Mhm,
And we've seen organizations remove the functionality of the USB port in some of these controls systems devices and their computers there. So there's a number of different things, obviously, but it's really one being very cognizant of it. And sometimes it could be as simple as, yes, people, writing down their passwords and having it, in front of them all the time. But again, if we do limit the amount of access, who accesses it, that's definitely a big part of it. But then, of course, the other protocols, and a few that we mentioned. Um, and then, of
mhm,
course, you still need people. You can't use smart systems to automate everything,
mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
And that highlights a big part of this Oldmar facility, right? There was an operator who was there. He obviously saw the first blip and thought kind of nothing of it because of the management thing that you mentioned. But then when he saw it happen again and the level increased drastically, he was like, "All right, well, I got to make this change right now." So clearly, there that you still need smart people behind the smart system, right? Could you talk about like what kind of defense an operator then plays in that whole system, and not just so you have the security of the system itself, but you also have the human element of that. What kind of defense parameter does an operator play in that? Because obviously in this situation, it was critical.
Right. Yeah. So in that case, for example, and in many utilities, there are parameters and there are set points, high limits, low limits, for example. Rate of change. So, for example, if the chlorination levels were changing too rapidly, you might get a notification and an alarm. Um, but at the same time, the operator and operations, they really know their own system, right? And
Mhm,
technically, they're able to run their facilities without any of these smart systems,
mhm,
right? It's just automating a lot of things to make it easier, to make it safer, and ultimately make it more efficient. But in the case of Oldsmar, for example, they were able to see, the operators actually saw that there was something not right, right? Before any kind of alarm, it sounds like, was triggered, right?
mhm.
So from that perspective, you still need people to, humans, right, to monitor the system and just to make sure that things are operating properly. Many times when you automate a new system, for example, during commissioning of new systems, we make mistakes in terms of how the process should run. So we might have wrong set points, right?
Mhm.
Alarms are not configured properly and so forth. So again, from that perspective, you still need people to drive that configuration and to drive those business rules and the logic there. And it
Yeah.
goes the same without saying in terms of when the system is fully commissioned and running on a daily basis, on a real-time basis, that you need people to constantly monitor and basically check on things to make sure that it's running smoothly.
Yeah. Well, and I imagine even just regularly checking those set points to make sure they're still what they should be is probably a good idea, right?
Yeah, and that takes you to also, with these smart systems, there's a lot of sensors and instrumentation, of course, and you still need people, for example, to calibrate those devices and instruments, right? So
Yeah.
again, people are definitely a big part of this.
Yeah. We've talked a little bit about some of the countermeasures that these smart systems have, about kind of the alarm systems, the set points, and stuff like that. Again, reading reports about this Oldsmar incident, it sounds like they're that didn't seem like there was some type of alarm in place, but they were able to catch something very quickly because they saw it. How critical are alarms like that? How common is that in these systems? And what what should people be thinking about when they're setting those types of alarms so that they make sure that they're have a good understanding of what's happening in their plant at a given time?
Yeah, so alarming is a really big topic, and a lot of the times, initially people will set too many alarms, and you get a lot of, I wouldn't call them false alarms, but nuisance alarms is what the industry
Hmm.
calls it. But absolutely, though, you have certain critical parts of the process, and you definitely need alarming in terms of, like, for example, like I mentioned, rate of change, low level, high level types of alarms that need to be in place to catch things that go out of spec, right?
Hmm.
Out of bounds. And if one doesn't have that in place, it's absolutely needed in terms of putting that. And that's why we have these automation systems to help automate that process, because you can't expect operations or people to sit there constantly to monitor everything, right?
Hmm.
It's like watching a videotape or something, right? You got to watch everything. No, if you're using some analysis and analytics to say, hey, if these three conditions are met, give me an alarm or a notification because might have a possible issue,
Hmm.
and you really want to catch that before that happens. So again, you need people to come up with the proper logic, who know how the process works, and from there, you can do the necessary programming to generate, alarms that mean something, so they don't become just nuisance alarms and people do pay attention.
Yeah. I like that you brought up that someone can't be looking at it all the time. And I think about that a lot because of how many small systems there are out there where there may only be the one guy doing that, right? And he needs a weekend too.
Yeah,
Or she. They need a weekend as well. So having those alarms in place affords them the opportunity to have time like that where they can spend time with their family and stuff and not be totally tied to the desk all the time.
right. And this is where, if you go back to what I kind of talked about earlier about the acronym for SCADA, is when it comes down to the data side of things. If you completely segregate that off, and you're now analyzing the data. So that's usually done in the business side of the network. But you have absolutely no control of that system. It's completely read only, view only of the data.
Hmm.
And that's where the analysis should take place, is outside of the control system itself.
Hmm.
And that's where you have a lot of in the world of smart water, a lot of solutions out there that look at that data, right? And from there, you can drive the necessary action that you need. And it's completely safe because it's view only, like I said. And that's where you really need to do the analysis. And there's more and more solutions out there that help us in terms of pattern recognition, for example, with neural networks and artificial intelligence as well.
Yeah. Now, the last thing I wanted to touch on with you also is kind of the changing and evolving roles of operators as well. Like with all of these systems and stuff, I imagine the qualifications for people has changed somewhat. They need to be familiar with things like this. What are some of the core qualities utilities should look for when they're hiring people who will be working with these types of systems? I imagine this is probably a conversation in its own right, but at least we can have a little bit of a discussion now to talk about some of the core elements to think about there.
Yeah, for sure. We hear a lot about, for example, our aging workforce. And you definitely have, when we're seeing many more young people, young professionals that are getting into the water industry, and they look at technology very differently. They have been brought up and have grown up knowing, tablets and smartphones and all that. So they actually really embrace technology, um,
Mhm.
and they in a way are really driving the need for having real-time information because everything for them is very instantaneous in general. So I think from that aspect, it's really good. And I really look at having people that have an open mind to learning, one, and then two is really using the technology to really help them make their lives easier and better and safer for everyone.
Mhm. Yeah, and it wouldn't hurt to have someone who is that analytical style personality who would love to look at that read-only information and surmise patterns and whatnot to create an even better system for you down the line.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And I think diversity is really important. So having a diverse team, like you say, someone who's really analytical and loves to look at that, definitely helps. And then, but we're definitely seeing more and more technology, which I think is fantastic. But at the end of the day, we still, like we talked about, you need people to run all these systems.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Gary, thanks so much for taking the time. I really appreciate you giving us a little bit more time. This isn't the first time that Gary's been on this show. We did an interview with him about 6 months ago, so you can check that out in the description below. But also remember that the webinar on digital resilience, there's a link to the registration page down in the description below as well. So definitely register for that, and you can hear some more awesome talk from Gary on March 30th.
Great. Thanks so much, Bob, for having me on.
Yeah, not a problem at all. Can't wait till the next time.
Likewise. Thank you.